The door that should not open to air was dry and heavy, as Sundar Pichai stood outside the enormous gates of an abandoned NASA research center. The evening sun cast long shadows across the cracked concrete. He had not planned to come here. Yet, something about the quiet whisper of the building in the distance, surrounded by rusted fences and faded signs, had pulled him closer. Earlier that morning, Sundar had been giving a talk at a university in California. Students had asked him questions about technology, about leadership, about staying humble while running a company that shaped the world. He had smiled politely and answered thoughtfully. He spoke of kindness, of staying grounded, of not forgetting where you came from. He told them to dream big but respect everyone they met along the way. But inside him, a strange heaviness grew all day, like an itch he couldn't scratch. So when the talk ended and his driver began to take him back to his hotel, Sundar noticed a small broken sign by the road. It read NASA Experimental Site, Restricted Access. The sign was almost invisible beneath years of dust. "Stop here," he said quietly. The driver looked confused. "Sir, this place is not safe. Nobody comes here anymore." But Sundar only smiled faintly and stepped out of the car, his shoes crunching against the gravel. "Just wait here. I won't take long." That was 3 hours ago. Now, standing before the massive doors of the abandoned building, Sundar felt a strange pull in his chest, like the building was calling him. He pushed lightly against the heavy metal doors. They groaned but did not move. He walked along the side, looking for another way in. He passed shattered windows, the remains of security cameras, vines twisting up the walls. He stopped when he saw a narrow service door almost hidden behind some overgrown bushes. The paint was peeling. It had a faded sticker that said, "Property of NASA, no entry." Sundar stared at that then. Without knowing why, he reached out, turned the handle, and pushed. The door opened with a low creak. Inside was darkness and dust. The air was thick, smelling of rust and old paper. Sundar stepped inside, letting the door close softly behind him. The world outside disappeared in an instant. He stood in a wide hallway, its floor scattered with fallen ceiling tiles and yellowed documents. Broken lights hung overhead. He took slow, quiet steps, his heart beating faster than usual. The silence was not complete. There were faint sounds, like whispers, but he couldn't tell if they came from the wind outside or from deep within the building. Sundar moved forward, his eyes adjusting to the dim light that filtered through small cracks and holes. The hallway split into two paths. To the left was a stairwell leading down. To the right, the corridor continued, lined with doors marked with faded numbers. He chose the corridor. Each door he passed seemed to hide a story. Some were locked, others stood slightly open. He peeked into one room and saw what looked like an old laboratory. Overturned chairs and smashed computers lay everywhere. Scribbles of equations covered one wall, but half the chalk had been smeared. Like someone had tried to erase the truth in a hurry. Then he noticed something strange. At the far end of the corridor, one door stood perfectly clean. No dust, no cracks. As though it'd been freshly painted and cared for, though everything else around it was falling apart. He approached slowly. His hand hovered over the doorknob. He hesitated. Then he heard a clear sound from inside the room. Not a whisper this time, but a voice. It spoke his name. Sundar. His breath caught in his throat. He pulled his hand back. The voice came again, soft yet firm. "Come in." A chill ran down his spine, yet something inside him, the same feeling that had drawn him here in the first place, made him turn the knob. The door swung open without a sound. Inside was a circular chamber with walls made entirely of glass panels. Faint blue light glowed from the floor. In the center of the room was a large table, and on the table lay a single thin folder, perfectly placed, and sitting in a chair across the room was a woman. She looked up at him. She was wearing a faded NASA jumpsuit. Her hair was silver, her face lined with age, but her eyes were sharp, alive, watching him. Sundar took a step inside. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. The woman smiled. though her eyes did not soften. You finally came, she said. Sundar shook his head slowly. I don't understand. Who are you? How do you know me? The woman stood up and walked to the table, placing one hand on the folder. My name is Elena. I worked here many years ago. This building holds secrets you were never meant to see, but it also holds truths you've been searching for. He frowned, feeling his throat tighten. What do you mean? I don't even know why I'm here. Elena slid the folder across the table toward him. You were chosen to find this, she said simply. The folder was labeled in neat handwriting. Project Ian Sundar hesitated. Then he opened it. Got inside were photographs, reports, and strange diagrams. He flipped through them slowly, his hands trembling. The photographs showed rooms like the one he stood in now, but filled with strange machines and shimmering lights. The reports spoke of experiments with human memory, time perception, and something called the Eon Gate. One page caught his eye. It was a photograph of a boy standing in this very room, with bright lights swirling around him. And underneath, it was written, Subject 0, Sundar Pichai. Froze. His breath quickened. He stared at the boy in the photo. It was him, younger, but unmistakably him. He looked up at Elena, his voice shaking. What is this? How can this be me? Elena didn't answer at first. She walked to the far wall, pressing her hand against a panel. With a faint hum, part of the glass wall slid open, revealing another chamber behind it. Inside that chamber was a strange machine. It looked like a large metallic arch, with glowing lines etched into its surface. Cables snaked out from its base into the floor. We called it the Eon Gate, Elena said quietly. And you were the first to pass through it. You just don't remember. Sundar stumbled back a step. That's not possible. I would remember something like this. Elena shook her head slowly, her eyes full of something between sadness and pride. Memories are fragile things, she said. But you're here now, and soon you'll understand. Sundar stared at the archway, his mind spinning, everything. Inside him screamed that this was impossible. Yet at the same time, something deep within him, something he didn't even know was there, felt familiar. He turned back to Elena. Why did you bring me here? Why me? Her expression softened. Finally, and for the first time, she looked tired. Because, Sundar, she said gently, there are things only you can do, things only you were meant to see. And it all begins again tonight. Before he could reply, the lights in the room flared, the ground beneath them vibrating. A deep hum filled the air. The Eon Gate began to glow more brightly, its surface rippling. Like water. Elena stepped back, her eyes wide now, her voice urgent. You need to go through, she said. But Sundar shook his head, his feet frozen to the floor. I don't even know what's on the other side. The hum grew louder, and the air itself seemed to shimmer. Elena's voice rose above the noise. You have to trust yourself. Go now, before it's too late. But Sundar stood still, torn. Between fear and something he couldn't name, then the gate roared with light, and a sudden gust of wind blew through the chamber, scattering papers into the air. And through the roaring light of the gate, he thought he saw something. A figure, standing on the other side, waiting for him. The figure raised its hand, beckoning. Sundar took one slow, shaky breath. He stepped forward, closer to the gate, but just as he reached out his hand, the light burst into blinding brilliance, and the floor beneath him cracked with a deafening sound. And then everything went dark. Asterisk, the world behind the Gatavi. First thing Sundar Pichai felt was the cold. It was not just ordinary cold, not the kind that touched your skin on a winter morning. It was a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to sink into his bones, filling every part of him with a strange, sharp stillness. His eyes fluttered open, slowly. But at first, all he saw was darkness. He lay on a hard, smooth surface that felt like stone. The air around him was thick, carrying a faint metallic taste, and it hummed softly, like a low vibration running through the ground. He stayed still for a moment, trying to remember where he was. Then, like a sudden flood, the memory of the room, the woman named Elena, and the strange gate came rushing back. He pushed himself up on shaky hands and looked around. He was no longer. In the NASA building, he stood on a vast, open plain that stretched endlessly in every direction. The ground was dark and polished, reflecting faint blue lights that pulsed from beneath its surface. Above him, the sky was not like any sky he had ever seen. It was alive with shifting patterns of light and shadow, swirling like a storm yet perfectly silent. Faint stars blinked far away, but they moved too fast, like restless fireflies trapped in glass. He slowly got to his feet, feeling his legs tremble under him. He was dressed just as he had been before. Suit, tie, polished shoes, but here, they seemed absurdly out of place. He could feel the chill cutting through the fabric, but at the same time, there was a strange sense of warmth beneath the surface, as though the very ground was alive and watching him. Where am I? He whispered to himself, though the sound of his own voice seemed small. Almost swallowed by the vastness around him, there was no reply. He took a cautious step forward. The ground hummed a little louder beneath his feet, sending faint ripples of light outward with each movement. He walked slowly at first, then a little faster, each step making him feel both more determined and more afraid. Then he saw it, in the distance, rising like a silent sentinel. Against the strange sky, a tall black structure. It was shaped like an arch, much like the gate he had passed through, but larger, grander, and far older. Faint blue symbols glowed along its surface, shifting and rearranging themselves like living language drawn by. A force he couldn't name, Sundar began walking toward it as he moved. He noticed more details about this place. On either side of him were jagged stones jutting out of the ground, each covered in strange carvings that seemed to shimmer faintly when he passed. The air was filled with an odd sound, not quite a whisper, not quite a song, like voices. Speaking just beyond the edge of hearing, his mind began to race. What was this place? How did he already feel, as though he knew it, as though it remembered him? And who or what was the figure he thought he saw waiting for him on the other side of the gate? He pressed on, each step feeling heavier now, his breath growing more visible in the icy air. After what felt like hours, though it was impossible to measure time here, he finally reached the base of the towering arch. Up close, it was even more magnificent, its surface alive with shifting lights and patterns. He reached out and placed his hand gently on the smooth black stone. To his surprise, it was warm to the touch. And then it spoke, not with words, not with sound, but with a flood of images, memories, and feelings that poured into his mind all at once. He saw flashes of himself as a child, standing in this very place, though he could not have possibly been here before. He saw scientists in white coats gathered around him, their faces full of awe and worry. He felt the cold touch of machine, the bright glare of lights, and the strange sensation of being lifted, carried, through something he could not understand. And then he saw something else, something that made his knees go weak. He saw a city, shining and beautiful, but crumbling in silence. He saw people running, their faces twisted in fear, as the sky above them cracked and bled strange light. He saw himself standing at the center of it all, his hands glowing, his eyes filled with tears. Then the vision faded, and he was left gasping, leaning against the stone. What is happening to me? He whispered hoarsely. Behind him, a soft voice answered, "You're remembering." Sundar spun around. Standing there was the figure he had glimpsed through the gate. But now it was clear. It was a boy, perhaps 12 or 13, dressed in simple clothes, barefoot, with eyes that seemed far older than his years. He stood, calmly, watching Sundar with a faint smile that held no malice, only quiet understanding. "Who are you?" Sundar asked, his voice shaking. The boy tilted his head slightly. "You already know?" Sundar shook his head furiously. "No. I've never seen you before. I've never been here before." The boy stepped closer, his bare feet silent on the glowing ground. "You have, long ago. You were the first to cross. The first to see." Sundar backed away, his mind spinning. No, that can't be true. I would remember something like this. I would. The boy stopped just in front of him now, close enough that Sundar could see faint patterns of light dancing in his irises. Not all memories belong in the light. The boy said softly, "Some are kept in the dark until they're needed." Sundar stared at him, struggling to find words. Why? Why me? Why was I brought here? What is this place? The boy's faint smile faded. His expression grew serious, almost sad. "This is the threshold," he said. "The space between what was and what will be. And you are the key. You always have been." Before Sundar could ask more, the ground beneath them trembled. The arch above them flared with light, and the air thickened, the sound of whispers. Growing louder, almost frantic, the boy turned his head toward the arch, his eyes narrowing. "They're coming," he said quietly. Sundar felt a chill run down his spine. "Who's coming?" The boy didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out and gently took Sundar's hand. His skin was warm, and somehow the touch calmed the storm of fear inside Sundar. "You need to remember everything before they find you," the boy said. "There isn't much time." With that, the boy began walking toward a narrow path that seemed to appear out of nowhere, winding around the base of the arch and disappearing into the distance. Sundar followed, though every instinct in him screamed to turn back. The path led them through a series of strange formations, towering spires of black stone, glowing pools of water that reflected not the sky, but scenes from his own life, and strange, delicate bridges that shimmered underfoot at one point. Sundar stopped at the edge of one of the pools, staring into it. He saw himself as a young boy in India, sitting at a wooden desk, studying under the dim glow of a single bulb. He saw his mother cooking in the small kitchen, his father adjusting his glasses as he read the newspaper. He saw the kindness in their eyes, the quiet sacrifices they made so he could learn, so he could dream. He felt a lump rise in his throat. The boy watched him silently, letting him take it in. "You come from kindness?" the boy said gently. "You carry it with you, even here." Sundar tore his eyes away from the water and followed the boy again, his steps heavier now, burdened with both sorrow and strange resolve. After what felt like another eternity, they reached a vast open space. In the center stood a giant circular platform, its edges lined with faint symbols that glowed like fireflies. Above it, the sky swirled with dark clouds, lightning flickering silently within. The boy stopped at the edge of the platform and turned. "To Sundar, this is where it ends," he said softly. "And where it begins again?" Sundar swallowed hard, his hands trembling. "I don't understand. What do I have to do?" The boy pointed to the center of the platform, where a single stone pedestal stood, bathed in pale light. Resting on it was a small black orb, smooth and perfectly round. "You must take it," the boy said. "And when you do, you will remember everything." Sundar stared at the orb, feeling his breath quicken. "What happens then?" Yes, the boy's eyes darkened, though his voice remained calm. "Then they will come for you." Before Sundar could respond, the ground began to tremble violently. The sky overhead cracked open with blinding light, and from the far edge of the plain, dark shapes began to emerge. Tall, faceless figures, moving with impossible speed, their forms flickering like shadows caught in a storm. The boy's grip on Sundar's hand tightened. "You have to choose," the boy said urgently. "Take it now, or everything will be lost." Sundar looked at the orb, then at the approaching figures. He felt his heart pounding, his thoughts screaming, but in the midst of all the fear and confusion, he remembered something. The quiet smile of his mother, the gentle advice of his father, the respect and kindness they had shown him even when the world had been hard. He took a slow, deep breath, and then he stepped forward toward the pedestal. The ground shook harder, the whispers now deafening, the figures closing in. His hand hovered over the orb, just inches away. He could feel it already, warmth, light, memories pressing against the edge of his mind. Just as his fingers touched its surface, the light around him exploded, and everything was consumed in a brilliant, blinding white, and in that final instant before everything vanished, he heard the boy's voice. Clear and steady, you were always meant to find your way back. Then, silence. Asterisk the memory of what was lost when Sundar opened his eyes. Again, he was not on the platform. He was not holding the orb. He was not anywhere that resembled the strange world beyond the gate. Instead, he found himself standing in a narrow alleyway, the air thick with smoke and dust, the faint scent of burning metal clinging to everything around him. He staggered slightly, his mind disoriented, his legs unsteady. It took him a few moments to realize he was barefoot now, his suit jacket torn and smeared with ash. He looked up and saw a sky that was fractured, bleeding strange colors that shimmered like oil on water. Tall buildings loomed on either side of him, but they were crumbling, their walls cracked and broken, their windows shattered. He began walking slowly, each step sending up small clouds of dust. As he moved forward, faint voices began to rise around him. They came from all directions, echoing off the walls, weaving together like a mournful chorus. Some voices cried out in fear. Others whispered names he almost recognized. What is this place? Sundar murmured, his voice hoarse. Though no one answered, he turned a corner and froze. There, in the center of what had once been a grand square, stood a massive tree. Its branches stretched impossibly high into the fractured sky, and its roots twisted through the cracked earth like ancient veins. But the tree was dying, its bark split and blackened, its leaves shriveled and falling in slow motion, each one glowing faintly before it touched the ground and dissolved into asterisk. He felt a weight settle in his chest as he stared at it, an inexplicable grief that threatened to crush him. Beneath the tree, scattered across the square, were people. Dozens of them, their forms hazy and indistinct, as though they were made of smoke and memory. They moved in slow, deliberate motions, picking up fragments of something invisible, trying to rebuild what could no longer stand. One of them turned toward him. It was a young woman. Her face streaked with soot, her eyes tired, but kind. She tilted her head and studied him for a long moment before speaking. You shouldn't be here yet, she said softly. Sundar swallowed hard, his hands trembling at his sides. I don't know where here is. The woman smiled faintly, though there was no joy in it. This is what remains of what we lost, of what you lost. Her words cut through him like a knife. He took a shaky step forward, his voice barely a whisper. What did I lose? She gestured to the tree. Everything, she said simply. Breath caught in his throat as he looked at the dying tree again. He couldn't explain it, but some part of him, some quiet, buried part, understood this was no ordinary tree. It was a memory. His memory, their memory. A place where all kindness, all hope, all resilience had once grown. And now it was withering, fading into nothing. He felt the grief deepen, sharp and relentless, but also something else, anger. Not at the people here, not even at himself, exactly. But at the sense that something precious had been stolen, hidden. From him, broken beyond repair, he turned back to the woman. How do I fix it? Her faint smile faded, her expression softening into something more fragile. She looked at him with quiet respect, as though she knew how heavy the question was. How much it cost him to ask it. You remember, she said. Gently, he frowned, confused. Remember what? But before she could answer, the ground beneath them shuddered. A low, distant roar rose in the air, and the fractured sky above them cracked wider. Threads of black light spilling through, like spilled ink. The smoky figures in the square froze, their heads turning toward the horizon as one. Sundar followed their gaze. At the edge of the square. The faceless figures he had seen before were returning, tall, jagged shadows that moved like a storm front. Their forms shifting and breaking as they came closer. Their presence was suffocating. The air growing colder and heavier with each passing second. The woman's eyes darkened with fear now. She stepped back, her voice urgent. You don't belong here anymore. You need to leave before they find you. But Sundar shook his head, his jaw tightening. Not until I understand. Not until I remember. The woman's lips parted as though to argue, but she stopped herself. Instead, she reached out and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. Her touch was warm despite the chill around them. Then look closer. She whispered Dot in that instant. The square dissolved around him, replaced by a torrent of memories flooding his mind. He saw himself as a boy again, standing in the small house in India, clutching a book to his chest, his father's voice gentle as he spoke of patience and perseverance. He saw his mother's tired hands preparing dinner late into the night, always smiling despite the ache in her back. He saw the narrow streets of his childhood, the neighbors who shared what little they had, the quiet dignity of people who had every reason to give up but never did. He saw the first time you left home, stepping onto a crowded train, his heart heavy with both hope and fear. He saw the first doors that closed in his face, the sleepless nights, the quiet resolve that kept him moving forward. And he saw something else. The NASA building, the experiments, the glowing arch. Himself as a boy standing in the chamber, surrounded by men and women in white coats. He saw their worried faces as they adjusted dials, took notes, whispered to each other. He felt the strange warmth of the gate as he stepped through it for the first time, and then he saw darkness, and silence, and nothing. The memory cut off like a broken thread, leaving him gasping for breath, clutching at his chest as the woman's hand fell away. The square returned around him, the whispers louder now, the faceless figures closer than ever. The tree's branches shook violently as another crack split the sky. The woman's eyes locked on his, filled with quiet urgency. "You've seen enough," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Now go, before they take it all from you again." But Sundar stood his ground, even as fear clawed at him, even as the shadows closed in. "I won't run," he said quietly. The woman's faint smile returned, but there was sadness in it now. "You've always been stubborn," she murmured, just like before. The ground shuddered violently, and one of the faceless figures lunged forward, its jagged form reaching for him. Sundar instinctively raised his hands, but instead of touching him, the figure froze just inches away, as though hitting an invisible barrier, and then he heard it. Another voice, not the woman's, not the boy's, but his own, echoing all around him. "You cannot lose what you carry inside you." The shadow recoiled at the sound, its form flickering and breaking apart. The others hesitated, their movements suddenly less certain. Sundar took a deep breath, feeling something shift within him, a faint warmth that began to glow in his chest. Spreading through him like sunlight cutting through fog, he looked back at the woman. "Tell me what I have to do," he said firmly. Her eyes softened, and this time her smile was genuine, though still tinged with sorrow. "You already know." She whispered and then she was gone. The square was empty now. The smoky figures and the woman dissolved into nothing. Only Sundar and the dying tree remained, its last few leaves trembling in the unnatural wind. The faceless figures gathered at the edge of the square, their jagged forms shifting restlessly, but they no longer advanced. They watched him with something like caution, as though waiting for him to decide. Sundar turned back to the tree. He approached it slowly, placing one hand on its cracked trunk. The bark felt rough and cold at first, but as he pressed his palm against it, he felt that warmth again, faint but steady, like a quiet heartbeat. He closed his eyes, letting the memories flow through him, the kindness of his parents, the sacrifices of his family, the humility of the people who had shaped him, the respect he had been shown, the respect he had given, the resilience that had carried him this far. When he opened his eyes, the tree was glowing faintly now, the blackened cracks softening into deep grooves of light. The leaves stopped falling. He took a deep breath, and then he whispered, "I remember." The ground beneath him pulsed with light, and the whispers in the air faded into silence. The faceless figures retreated slowly, dissolving into shadows that melted into the fractured horizon. The sky above him began to mend itself, the cracks knitting together, the strange light softening into something more like dawn. But just as he allowed himself to breathe, just as the warmth of the tree began to grow stronger, a sharp sound cut through the silence. A single high-pitched crack, like glass shattering. He turned toward the source of the sound and froze. The boy was standing at the edge of the square. Again, but this time his eyes were dark, his face unreadable. "You've only just begun," the boy said quietly. Then the sky split wide open once more. A blinding light pouring through, and the ground beneath Sundar's feet gave way. He fell, the world spinning around him. And the last thing he saw was the boy reaching out a hand that never quite reached him. And then darkness. Asterisk through the fracture when Sundar opened his eyes again. He felt like he was falling still. The sensation of weightlessness lingered, like he was suspended between two worlds, drifting through a space that refused to obey any rules he knew. All around him, the darkness was vast and endless. Yet at its edges, faint glimmers of light appeared and vanished like fleeting stars. His body twisted in the void as though moved by invisible currents. There was no up, no down. At times, he thought he was lying still, and then suddenly he was spinning again, the lights streaking past him like silent comets. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. His voice felt swallowed by the strange nothingness. Around him. Then the falling stopped. He landed hard on a cold surface, his knees buckling under the impact. He stayed there, on hands and knees, gasping, trying to steady himself. The ground beneath him was glassy and black, but when he peered closer, he saw that it was not glass at all. It was water, perfectly still. So still it reflected him with haunting clarity, though there was no ripple when he moved. He pushed himself upright, and slowly his surroundings came into focus. He stood in the center of what seemed to be an enormous chamber, circular, stretching so far in every direction that its edges faded into mist. Above him loomed a dome of fractured light, pieces of color and shadow locked together in impossible patterns. The faint hum of the place vibrated in his bones. It was beautiful, but it carried a sharp undertone of something that felt like grief. As he took a hesitant step forward, the surface beneath his feet began to glow faintly, marking his path with delicate lines of soft gold. He followed the path, each step echoing slightly, though the chamber seemed impossibly vast and empty. After a while, the path brought him to the center of the chamber where a tall mirror stood, though calling it a mirror felt wrong. It was a smooth, black surface framed by intricate carvings, but instead of showing his reflection, it shimmered with faint shapes that shifted and flickered. He reached out to touch it, but before his fingers could make contact, a faint voice spoke behind him. "You shouldn't touch it yet." He spun around. The boy stood there again, only this time he looked different. His hair was longer, his clothes torn and streaked with ash, and there was a heaviness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. His gaze was fixed on Sundar, unreadable. "Why?" Sundar asked quietly, though his voice shook. The boy walked closer, his bare feet silent on the glowing surface. He stopped a few steps away and tilted his head slightly. "Because it shows what you're not ready to see," he said simply. Sundar clenched his fists. "I've already seen enough," he said firmly, though his heart was pounding. The boy's faint smile was sad this time. "You've seen pieces," he corrected softly, "but not the whole." Sundar turned back to the mirror, the faint shapes behind its surface shifting faster now, as though they sensed his attention. "Then tell me what I'm supposed to do," Sundar said, his voice rising. The boy lowered his gaze for a moment, then met Sundar's eyes again, and there was something there now, something deeper than sadness, something almost like regret. "You're supposed to remember who you are," the boy said quietly. Sundar stared at him. "I know who I am." The boy shook his head once, slowly. "You know who you became," he said, "not who you were." Before Sundar could reply, the surface of the mirror flared suddenly with bright light, and the air around them thickened. The boy took a step back, his expression tightening. "They're getting closer," he said under his breath. And then, just beyond the edges of the mist, Sundar saw them again, the faceless figures, but now there were more of them than ever. Dozens, maybe hundreds. They moved like a tide, silent but unstoppable, their jagged forms weaving through the mist, their edges flickering as though they were made of fractured glass. Sundar felt fear rising in his chest. sharp and cold, but something else too. A quiet determination, a strange kind of strength he didn't quite understand. He turned back to the boy. What happens if they reach me? The boy's jaw tightened. Then you forget everything, he said. Again. And this time you may never find your way back. Sundar took a slow breath and turned back to the mirror. The shapes in its surface were clearer now, and for the first time he realized what they were. Memories. His memories? He saw himself as a child, walking barefoot to school, clutching a thin book in his hands. He saw himself as a young man sitting on the edge of a train platform, waiting, dreaming. He saw his parents' faces, tired but proud. He saw the streets of his hometown, the neighbors who shared what little they had, their kindness and dignity carved into him like stone. But then the memories grew darker. He saw the NASA building, the room where the arch first glowed. The scientists, worried glances, the feeling of being pulled apart, scattered like dust and put back together in pieces. He saw himself standing inside the arch. As a boy, his hands glowing, his eyes wide with both wonder and fear. And then he saw what came after. The silence, the nothingness, the forgetting. He stumbled back from the mirror. Gasping, the boy's voice was softer now. They took it from you, he said. Sundar turned to him. Why? Why would they do that? The boy's faint smile was bitter. Because you were the only one who could fix it, he said. And they were afraid you might. The ground beneath them shook suddenly, and the first of the faceless figures stepped out of the mist, its jagged form towering over them, its head tilting as though it could see into him. Sundar backed away instinctively. But the boy reached out and grabbed his hand, stopping him. Don't run, the boy said. Then what do I do? Sundar whispered, his voice shaking. The boy's grip tightened. You remember? He said. Sundar turned back to the mirror, his chest heaving. The figures were closer now, the air growing colder, heavier, the whispers deafening. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and pressed his palm flat against the surface. At first, nothing happened. Then the mirror rippled under his touch, and the memories inside it surged forward, pouring into him like water. He gasped as the world around him vanished again. He was standing in the NASA chamber, but it was years ago now, the day of the experiment. The scientists were all there, watching him with a mix of awe and fear. The arch was alive with light, its surface rippling. He could feel the heat of it, the pull of it in his chest. He stepped forward, his younger self, his feet steady. Are you ready? One of the scientists asked. He turned to her. It was Elena. She looked younger here, her hair darker, her eyes softer. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. But the boy himself only smiled faintly and shook his head. Already did, he said simply, and then he stepped through. The memory shattered like glass. Sundar staggered back into the chamber, clutching his chest. The mirror's surface went dark, and the figures stopped advancing. They stood at the edges of the light, watching him, but they did not move closer now. The boy released his hand, his expression calmer now, though still grave. You remember? Now, he said. Sundar nodded faintly, though his hand still shook. Yes, he said hoarsely. The boy's faint smile returned, though there was no triumph in it, only quiet respect. Then you know what comes next, he said. Sundar swallowed hard. No, I don't. The boy's gaze deepened, and his voice was almost a whisper now. You fixed what was broken, he said. Sundar turned back to the mirror. It was dark now, but a faint crack of light appeared in its surface, growing slowly. He felt the ground hum beneath his feet, and the figures began to shift restlessly, their whispering rising again. He took a step closer, the warmth in his chest growing stronger. But just as he reached out again, the chamber split open with a deafening roar, the dome above them cracking wide, and a wave of blinding light rushed in. Sundar shielded his eyes. But through the light he saw something, another figure standing on the far side of the chamber, waiting. Not the boy, not the woman, but himself. Older, worn, but stronger. The older Sundar raised a hand, beckoning silently. And just as the light swallowed everything. The boy's voice rang out one last time, soft but steady. You remember who you are? And then nothing. Asterisk the other side of himself when the light finally dimmed. Sundar stood still for a long time, unsure if his legs would even hold him. He felt the hum of the ground beneath his feet again, faint but steady, as though it was breathing with him. Around him, the vast chamber had changed. Where once there had been mist and fractured shadows, there was now clarity, sharp lines of stone and glass, tall pillars carved with symbols that glowed softly, and the mirror, no longer black, but glowing white, standing silent and still behind him. The air felt warmer now, but it carried a kind of weight, as though the room itself was watching him, waiting. And there, at the far end, stood the figure he had glimpsed through the light. Sundar took a hesitant step forward, then another, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the polished floor. The figure stood perfectly still, his face cast in a faint glow of the room, his posture calm, his hands folded lightly in front of him. As Sundar drew closer, the truth of it settled on him like a heavy fog. He was looking at himself, but not quite. The man before him was older, not much in years, but in presence. His face was lined in ways Sundar didn't yet recognize, his eyes deeper, holding something between weariness and wisdom. His suit was torn at the sleeve, dust clung to his shoes, but he stood with quiet strength, as though nothing in this world or the next could shake him anymore. They stood facing each other in silence, the faint hum of the room filling the space between them. Finally, Sundar spoke, his voice quiet but steady. Who are you? The older version of himself tilted his head slightly, his expression softening. I am who you chose not to become, he said. The words struck Sundar harder than he expected. He swallowed, his throat dry. What does that mean? The older man gave a faint smile, though it was tinged with sadness. It means you've run from yourself for so long you forgot where you began. It means you've worn humility like a shield instead of a truth. It means you've carried kindness for others, but none for yourself. Sundar's hands curled into fists at his sides. I have done everything I could, he said, his voice tight. The older man nodded slowly. You did, he agreed, but not everything you should. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crack the floor. Sundar's chest ached, though he couldn't quite say why. He looked down, his reflection faint in the shining surface below him. I don't understand, he whispered. I've always tried to do the right thing. I've tried to lead with respect, with humility, with kindness. What else was I supposed to do? The older man stepped closer, his gaze steady, not unkind. You forgot yourself, he said simply. You let the noise of the world drown out the boy who first dreamed. The boy who carried his parents' hopes like a fragile flame. You gave the world everything, except the truth you locked away right here. He tapped his chest gently. Sundar stared at him, his breath catching. The truth of it settled over him slowly, painfully. The boy, the woman, the tree, the mirror, all of it fragments of himself, scattered and buried, waiting for him to gather them again. Asterisk.